Hi, I'm David Taub, and welcome to the Parshah Rabbit Hole, where I find something weird in the weekly Torah portion and follow it all the way down until it gets even weirder. This week we're going to be exploring a few mysteries surrounding some tiny jars that belong to Yaakov Avinu, or Jacob.
My cans! My precious antique cans!
So let's dive right on in. In this week's Torah portion, Yaakov, or Jacob, is finally going back home to confront his brother Esav, or Esau. He's traveling back with his entire family and all of his stuff, and it's a huge production, and at one point they get to the river, and Yaakov crosses his entire family and all of his possessions and his livestock and all of his people across first, and then he remains alone. This is what it says in the Parsha. V'yivasser Yaakov levade, v'yivayik ish imay ad aleis hashachar. Yaakov was left alone, and a figure wrestled with him until the break of dawn. So everybody and everything else was already on the other side of the river. Yaakov was all alone, and somebody takes the opportunity to pick a fight. According to Midrash, this figure who wrestles with Jacob is the Malach of Esav, the guardian angel of Esau. They fight all night, and eventually, very famously, the angel just gives up but decides to injure Yaakov's hip, and that's where the mitzvah of not eating the gid hanasha comes from, not eating the sciatic nerve of an animal. So the question that everyone wants to know is, why was Yaakov all alone in the first place? Why did he stay behind? There's actually a halacha that you can't put yourself in danger like that when you're traveling.
Yaakov father always say, best way to avoid punch, no be there.
So why was Yaakov all alone? Rashi tells us that he went back for something. This is what Rashi says. Shochach pachim ketanim v'chazer aleihem. He forgot some small jars and he went back for them. And Rashi brings this from a Gemara. Various commentaries explain that the reason why this is pachim ketanim, small jars, is to point out that they're insignificant, because the Torah already told us that Yaakov crossed everything he had over, so it should be that nothing was left. So what was left? Some small jars. But, according to Rabbeinu Bachya, small jars might mean something else. He says that Yaakov Avinu was concerned that if he didn't go back for these small jars, then the children would have nothing to drink out of. So according to Rabbeinu Bachya, pachim ketanim, small jars, doesn't mean jars that are small, but it means jars for small people, for children, which I am going to translate as sippy cups. Yaakov Avinu went back to get some sippy cups. Okay, so now we have two ways of looking at pachim ketanim. Either Yaakov Avinu was going back for some small jars that other people might consider insignificant, or he was going back for some sippy cups. But you might be wondering, where does this information come from? How do we know that Yaakov Avinu went back for pachim ketanim? Well, according to the Balei Tosfos, it comes from an Al-Tikrei. Al-Tikrei is a Midrashic tool which is used to extract more information from a verse by changing around letters.
To make histories and mysteries and even folklore. That's what all those 22 letters are for.
So the Tanaim or Amoraim, the Talmudic sages who do this Al-Tikrei, will change the pronunciation of a word or move around letters or change a letter to bring out a new meaning in the verse. The formula goes, do not read this, but rather that. And of course it's worth pointing out that this never takes away the actual meaning of the verse, it's just a way of extracting even more information that we otherwise wouldn't have known. So according to the Balei Tosfos, these pachim ketanim come from an Al-Tikrei. The verse says that Yaakov remained alone, levadai, and so the Gemara tells us, Al-Tikrei levadai, ela lekadai. Don't read levadai, he remained alone, but read lekadai. Kad is a jug, so he remained for his jug. Okay, so it's good to know how this information was extracted from the actual text of the Torah. But I was wondering, how does it work exactly? How do you get from levadai to lekadai? How do you replace a vase with a kuf? So I found a few different options for how we could do this. I'll start with the one that I think is least likely, and that's misper katan. Misper katan is a way of playing with the gematria of letters, the numerical value of the Hebrew letters. So base is 2, kuf is 20, and resh is 200. So one way of doing gematria, of getting the numerical value of Hebrew words, is by reducing every single number down into its base number, taking off all the zeros.
Be not picky.
So that 2, 20, and 200 would all just be 2, in which case base and kuf are interchangeable. So according to this, the way we get from levade to lakade is by turning that vase, which is 2, into a kuf, which is 20. But that doesn't seem likely to me. I haven't really seen that type of gematria stuff in Talmudic exegesis. It seems to me like it's more of a Kabbalah thing. If anybody out there has examples of it where it is used in Gemara or Midrash, let me know. The more likely possibility is that the vase was exchanged with a kuf because they're visually similar. In fact, it happens all the time in rabbinic literature where there's a base and a chaf that were accidentally interchanged, just because the printer mixed it up. And apparently this is something which was also done deliberately, and there are examples of it in Midrash. But I couldn't find anybody saying specifically in this case that that's what was happening, but it seems likely. But I did find a couple of sources for one more way of getting from base to kuf, and that's baklam. Baklam is an acronym for the 4 letters in Hebrew that are used as prefixes: base, kuf, lamed, and mem. Base means in or with, kuf means like or as, lamed means to, and mem means from. In Yafa Toyer, which is a commentary on Midrash, he explains this mechanism. The context there is that he's saying that that's what's being applied there, and he brings a few different examples of different places where base and kuf used as a prefix could be interchangeable. And he brings our Gemara specifically, al tikra levade ela lakade, and uses that as an example of when these prefix letters, base and kuf, can be swapped out for each other. Which is weird, because in both of those words, levade and lakade, the vase and the kuf are not prefix letters. They're part of the actual root of the word. So I don't understand how a baklam letter swap would work in this case. Again, if anybody out there has any insight on this, please put it in the comments. But that's not the biggest mystery about this al tikre levade ela lakade. The biggest mystery is that it doesn't exist. Different commentaries quote it in different ways, but many of them quote the Gemara, the Talmud, directly as saying it, but it doesn't. If we look at the Gemara in Chulin, all it says there is that Yaakov stayed behind for some pachim ketanim, some small jars, but it doesn't say how it knows about the small jars. So it's not mentioned in this Gemara, it's not mentioned in any other Gemara, and it's not mentioned in any Midrash. Okay, so maybe the medieval commentaries, the Rishonim, innovated this al tikre. But, according to Mizrahi, no, you can't do that. He says that this al tikre levade ela lakade is a big mistake.
I've made a huge mistake.
And he goes on and says, you can't do that. Nobody can make it al tikre anymore. Only the Tanaim and Amoraim, the sages of the Mishnaic and Talmudic era, could make it al tikre. It's a Midrashic tool that is now no longer available to us. And he says even in the Gaonic period they couldn't do an al tikre. So now we have the mystery of where this al tikre comes from, and I'm sorry, I looked around, I couldn't find any more information on it. And this sent me down another little side rabbit hole for days that pretty much led nowhere, where I was trying to figure out what the line is for what types of Midrashic wordplay people are still allowed to do today, and what things are official Midrashic tools that were only allowed in the Talmudic era. Because there's a lot of stuff that happens, especially in Kabbalah and Chassidus, where we play with words, and I would love to see sources that create clear guidelines. And like anything in Torah, I would assume that there would be places that say you can't do anything, and there would be places that are a lot more permissive. But I couldn't find any examples. If anybody out there has some good examples of this, please put it in the comments. So that's the end of the trail of where these sippy cups came from conceptually. But there's actually a lot of very fascinating information about where these sippy cups could have come from physically. How did Yaakov get them? In last week's Parsha, at the beginning of Yaakov's whole journey, he runs away from his brother Esav, from his parents' home. On his way there, it says that he stopped for the night and he uses a rock as a pillow, and he wakes up in the morning and he pours oil on the rock and he makes a vow and he knows that Hashem is going to protect him. So where did that oil come from? According to Midrash, this was heavenly oil that came from the heavens and Hashem gave it to him.
It's a miracle.
Shach al Torah fills in some gaps and gives us even more information about this heavenly miracle oil. He says that when Yaakov woke up in the morning, he found this jug of oil had appeared, and he poured it on the stone to anoint it, and when he did so, the jug just magically filled right back up. And he saw that this wasn't any ordinary jug, it was a special jug, a jug of blessing, and so he held on to it. And that's the kad, the jug, that Yaakov Avinu went back for in our Parsha. But he goes on and tells us even more. He says that this miraculous jug of oil stuck around. It stayed with the Jewish people. And it was used to anoint the Mishkan, the portable temple that was used when the Jews were traveling in the desert, and all of the utensils that were used there. And it was also used to anoint Aaron and his sons, all the Kohanim. And it was used to anoint all of the Jewish kings eventually. And he adds that there are a few different stories in Tanakh, later on in the prophets, that talk about different miracle oil stories. There's one with Eliyahu Navi, where Hashem sends him to the house of some woman and says that she'll give you food to eat, but she's poor, and all she has is 1 jar of oil and 1 jar of flour. And Eliyahu Navi, Elijah the prophet, tells her, don't worry about it, just make me some bread, and she does, and the jar magically refills. And according to Shach al Torah, that's the same jar. And there's other stories with other Nevi'im, other prophets, also about magical jars of oil, and according to this commentary, it's the same jar that stuck around and kept on refilling and was used in miraculous ways throughout many generations of Jewish history. Now, you might be thinking, hey, magical jar of oil that refills and gives you more oil than you expected to give you, that sounds familiar. That sounds like Chanukah. And the Maharshal makes that connection. He says that when Yaakov Avinu risked his life to go back for this heavenly jar of oil that Hashem gave to him, Hashem said, I'm going to repay you for this self-sacrifice that you did for a small jar of oil by saving your children, the Chashmonaim, with a small jar of oil. So according to this, when Yaakov Avinu went back for that small jug of oil, that ensured that later on there would be a miracle in the time of Chanukah with a small jug of oil. And I did find a few sources that said it's the same jug of oil that stuck around, and it was that small jar that belonged to Yaakov Avinu that eventually landed up in the hands of the Chashmonaim in the time of the Chanukah story. But I couldn't find a reputable place that said it clear enough that I was comfortable quoting it. If anybody else can find a good, clear, reputable source for that, please put it in the comments. So, to summarize, Yaakov Avinu went back for a small jar. It could be a sippy cup, or it could have been a miracle jar that magically refilled every time it was emptied. And not only did that jug of oil itself stick around for many generations being used for miracles, but it was also the inspiration for the miracle of Chanukah, and maybe it was even part of the Chanukah miracle. But that's not the end of this little jar of oil's connection to Chanukah. The Shalah goes on at length connecting this story of Yaakov Avinu to the story of Chanukah. But before we get there, first let's look at a Midrash. So if we go back to the story in the Parsha, we remember Yaakov remained alone for the small jars, and that's when he got attacked. V'yar ki le yachale v'yiga b'chaf yireche. The man, which Midrash tells us is Esav's guardian angel, so he attacks Yaakov's leg, and the word that it uses is kaf yerechoi. Now, kaf is an interesting word here, because usually it means the palm of the hand or the sole of the foot. So the commentaries have to do a little bit of work here to make it make sense in this context. What's the kaf of the thigh? And they have different ways of doing that, but whatever it is, the angel attacked Yaakov's thigh. Now, very often the word thigh or leg is connected euphemistically to reproductive organs. And according to the Midrash, when Esav's angel attacked Yaakov's leg, it was actually attacking Yaakov's descendants, every generation of Jews that has experienced persecution. The Shalah presents this as one continuous narrative, a story of Jewish persecution that begins with this angel attacking Yaakov and ends with the miracle of Chanukah. There's a lot there, and I recommend looking at it yourself, but I'm going to focus on one part here. The Shalah makes a connection here between the words kaf and pach, and points out that they're the same letters. Pach is pei chaf, and kaf is kaf fei. And it doesn't make a difference that it's pei and fei, or kaf and chaf, it's the same letter. Now both of these letters, fei and chaf, have normal and final forms. And in the final form for both of them, the bottom side opens up, leaving the bottom open. So a regular fei and a regular chaf are closed, and a final fei and a final chaf are open. And he says the letter pei represents the mouth, peh, and the letter chaf represents the hand, kaf. So this entire story of transcending anti-Semitism that begins with Yaakov Avinu and ends with Chanukah begins with a closed hand and an open mouth. And it ends with the miracle of Chanukah, with the miracle of the pach, with a closed mouth and an open hand. Now you could take this and get kind of a preachy lesson out of it and tell people, don't talk, be silent, silence is good, and give money to tzedakah. But that's not how I hear it. For me, this takes the two miracles of Chanukah, the military victory and the miraculous jar of oil, and combines them together in a way that's actually relevant to me and my life as a Jew right here, right now. Because for me, living in the time and place that I do, I am very fortunate. And even though anti-Semitism is very real, I right here and right now have a lot more freedom and a lot more opportunities than many of my ancestors did. But what I think this piece from the Shalah is telling me is that that freedom and that opportunity comes with responsibility. Part of transcending anti-Semitism and persecution is becoming aware of and utilizing the power of our actions and our words. Okay, that's it. That's the rabbit hole. As always, if you have any questions that lead me down other rabbit holes, or if you have information that I missed and you want to share with me, put it in the comments. Thank you for following me down the rabbit hole. If you find any sippy cups down here, those are mine.